If you're seeing this, it is not by accident. Something within you has already begun to move, quietly and without permission from the conscious mind. Long before awareness catches up, the psyche prepares itself for change. You may feel restless without knowing why, dissatisfied with explanations that once comforted you, or strangely drawn toward questions that refuse easy answers. This is how inner transformation announces itself, not loudly but persistently. A shift does not begin with certainty. It begins with tension. Old beliefs start to feel tight, like clothes you have outgrown. Patterns that once felt familiar now feel repetitive, even exhausting. You may notice the same situations returning in different forms, asking something from you that you have not yet been willing to give: attention. The inner world is demanding recognition, and it will repeat itself until it is seen. Discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is evidence that something true is trying to emerge. When the unconscious pushes toward consciousness, it often arrives as confusion, emotional unease, or a sense of being in between versions of yourself. The mind resists this stage because it prefers stability, but growth has never respected comfort. What feels like chaos is often a deeper order reorganizing itself. As this shift unfolds, you may feel compelled to slow down, to observe rather than react. The urge to control outcomes weakens, replaced by a strange trust in timing. This is not passivity, it is alignment. When you stop forcing answers, insight begins to surface on its own. Symbols, synchronicities, and meaningful coincidences appear, reflecting an inner readiness you may not yet fully understand. What is changing is not your external life first, but your relationship to it. You begin to question roles you play, expectations you inherited, and identities you accepted without examination. The self that is emerging does not seek approval, it seeks wholeness. This requires integrating the parts of yourself you once avoided, your doubts, your fears, and even your contradictions. If you're seeing this, it means you are standing at a psychological threshold. The old self is loosening its grip, and the new one has not yet fully formed. This is a sacred moment, even if it feels uncertain. Do not rush it. What arrives through patience and awareness becomes lasting. The shift has already begun. Your only task now is to remain conscious as it unfolds. Inner transformation rarely announces itself in clear language or deliberate intention. It begins beneath awareness, in the deeper layers of the psyche where instincts, memories, and unresolved experiences quietly shape perception. Long before a person decides to change, something within has already recognized that the old inner structure is no longer sufficient. This is why transformation often feels sudden when it reaches consciousness, even though it has been forming for a long time. The mind believes it has just arrived at a realization, but the inner world has been preparing the ground far in advance. The unconscious does not operate through logic or linear planning. It communicates through tension, repetition, emotional shifts, and subtle dissatisfaction. A person may feel restless without a clear cause, drawn away from routines that once felt meaningful, or emotionally affected by situations that previously seemed insignificant. These are not random disturbances. They are signals that an internal reorganization is underway. The psyche begins to loosen outdated beliefs and attachments before the conscious mind understands why they no longer fit. Because the ego values stability, it often resists this early stage of change. It tries to restore familiarity by explaining away discomfort or distracting itself with external goals. Yet the unconscious continues its work regardless of conscious resistance. Old coping mechanisms lose their effectiveness. Patterns repeat with increasing intensity. Emotions surface that cannot be easily suppressed. This is not sabotage, it is preparation. The unconscious is creating pressure, so awareness will eventually be forced to listen. When transformation finally enters consciousness, it often arrives as confusion rather than clarity. People expect insight to feel decisive and empowering, but true awareness first feels disorienting. The familiar inner narrative begins to fracture. Questions arise that cannot be answered with existing beliefs. This moment can feel like losing oneself, but it is actually the loosening of an identity that has outlived its purpose. Conscious awareness is catching up to a process that has already begun beneath the surface. This delayed recognition explains why meaningful change cannot be rushed. Conscious effort alone cannot initiate deep transformation. It can only cooperate with it once it is ready. When people attempt to force growth through sheer will, they often encounter exhaustion or frustration. The unconscious follows its own rhythm, guided by readiness rather than desire. Awareness becomes effective only when it aligns with this deeper timing. As consciousness gradually integrates what the unconscious has been preparing, perception begins to shift. Situations are interpreted differently. Reactions slow down. There is a growing sense that life is asking something more honest and less defensive from the individual. This is not the result of deliberate self-improvement, but of an internal realignment that began long before it was named. Inner transformation does not start when we decide to change. It starts when something within us has already decided that remaining the same is no longer possible. Repeating patterns in life are rarely the result of coincidence or bad luck. They are expressions of unresolved inner material that continues to seek recognition through experience. When the same situations, relationships, conflicts, or emotional reactions appear again and again, it is not because life is stuck, but because something within the individual has not yet been consciously understood. The psyche uses repetition as a language, presenting the same lesson in different forms until awareness is able to receive it. These patterns often feel frustrating precisely because they appear to come from the outside. A person may believe they are encountering the same type of person, the same obstacle, or the same disappointment, without realizing that the common thread is internal. The unconscious does not distinguish between inner and outer reality in the same way the conscious mind does. What remains unresolved within seeks expression through external circumstances, drawing the individual into familiar scenarios that mirror unfinished psychological work. Avoidance strengthens repetition. When discomfort arises, the natural tendency is to escape, distract, or rationalize the experience away. Yet what is avoided internally does not disappear. It simply waits for another opportunity to surface. Each repetition increases in intensity because the psyche is attempting to break through resistance. What begins as mild unease may later appear as emotional distress, conflict, or a crisis that can no longer be ignored. The repetition is not punishment, but persistence. Many of these recurring themes are rooted in early experiences, unmet emotional needs, or beliefs formed during moments of vulnerability. Because these foundations were laid before conscious reflection was possible, they operate automatically. Without awareness, the individual reacts rather than chooses, reenacting the same responses while hoping for a different outcome. This creates the illusion of fate or inevitability, when in reality the pattern is sustained by unconscious identification with the past. Recognition is the turning point. When a repeating pattern is observed without judgment, its meaning begins to reveal itself. The emotional charge attached to the situation often points directly to the unresolved lesson. Strong reactions indicate areas where awareness has not yet been integrated. The pattern continues not because the person is incapable of change, but because the lesson has not yet been fully seen and accepted. Once attention is brought to the pattern, choice becomes possible. The external situation may look similar, but the internal response begins to shift. This subtle change alters the entire dynamic. The lesson no longer needs to repeat in the same way because its purpose has been fulfilled. Integration dissolves compulsion. What was once experienced as an obstacle becomes a source of insight. Repeating patterns are therefore invitations rather than failures. They signal areas of the self that are asking to be acknowledged, understood, and integrated. Life repeats itself only until consciousness is ready to listen. When awareness meets the lesson with honesty, the pattern loosens its grip and forward movement becomes natural rather than forced. Discomfort is often misunderstood as evidence that something has gone wrong, that a wrong choice has been made, or that one has drifted away from the correct path. In reality, discomfort is frequently the clearest indication that growth is taking place. When the inner world begins to expand beyond familiar limits, the psyche experiences tension. This tension is not a malfunction, but a natural response to transformation. Comfort belongs to the known. Growth begins where the known can no longer contain who we are becoming. The mind seeks predictability because it equates familiarity with safety. When circumstances, emotions, or thoughts disrupt that familiarity, the immediate reaction is to interpret the disturbance as a problem to be eliminated. Yet genuine development does not reinforce what is already stable, it challenges it. Discomfort arises when outdated beliefs, identities, or emotional defenses are being questioned. The unease signals that something previously unquestioned is now loosening its hold. Periods of discomfort often coincide with moments of increased awareness. As unconscious material surfaces, it brings emotions and insights that were once suppressed or ignored. This can feel unsettling, as the individual becomes aware of contradictions within themselves or truths that demand responsibility. The ego resists this exposure because it threatens the image it has carefully maintained. What feels like inner conflict is actually the process of integration beginning to unfold. Discomfort also appears when growth requires letting go. Attachment to roles, relationships, or expectations creates a sense of security, even when they no longer align with inner truth. Releasing them produces uncertainty, and uncertainty is inherently uncomfortable. Yet this space of not knowing is where transformation occurs. The old structure dissolves before the new one is fully formed, creating a temporary state of instability. Interpreting this instability as failure only prolongs the struggle. Many people attempt to escape discomfort by forcing positivity, seeking constant reassurance, or numbing themselves through distraction. These strategies may reduce immediate tension, but they also interrupt the growth process. Avoided discomfort does not disappear. It returns in different forms, often with greater intensity. When discomfort is met with awareness rather than resistance, it begins to reveal its purpose. It points directly to the edge of one's current limitations. As growth continues, the relationship to discomfort changes. It is no longer experienced solely as a threat, but as information. The individual learns to recognize unease as a signal that expansion is occurring. This does not mean seeking suffering, but allowing necessary tension to exist without prematurely trying to resolve it. Strength develops not through avoidance, but through conscious engagement with what feels difficult. Discomfort does not indicate misalignment. It often confirms it. It arises when a deeper truth is being integrated and the old self is adjusting to a wider awareness. Growth is rarely gentle, but it is purposeful. What feels uncomfortable now is shaping the capacity for clarity, resilience, and authenticity. When understood this way, discomfort becomes not an enemy, but a guide pointing toward meaningful change. True change does not begin with force, urgency, or the need to control outcomes. It begins with observation. The impulse to control life usually arises from fear of uncertainty, fear of loss, fear of not being enough. Control creates the illusion of safety, but it also limits awareness. When attention is fixed on manipulating results, little energy remains for understanding what is actually happening. Observation, by contrast, creates space. It allows life to reveal its patterns, meanings, and underlying movements without distortion. When a person shifts from controlling to observing, the relationship with experience fundamentally changes. Instead of reacting immediately, there is a pause. In that pause, insight becomes possible. Emotional responses that once seemed automatic are seen more clearly. Situations are no longer interpreted solely through personal desire or resistance, but as mirrors reflecting inner dynamics. This shift is subtle yet profound. It replaces compulsive action with conscious presence. Control seeks certainty before understanding. Observation accepts uncertainty as part of the process. The mind prefers quick answers because not knowing feels uncomfortable, But growth requires staying with questions long enough for deeper understanding to emerge. Observation is an act of patience. It allows unresolved inner material to surface naturally, rather than being forced into premature conclusions. What is forced often collapses. What is observed integrates. Much of human suffering comes from resisting what is. When reality does not align with expectations, control tightens. This creates inner tension and exhaustion. Observation loosens this struggle. It does not mean passivity or resignation, but clarity. By seeing events, emotions, and reactions without immediately trying to change them, a person gains access to their deeper meaning. Patterns that were invisible during constant action become clear through stillness. As observation deepens, the need to control gradually diminishes. One begins to recognize that many outcomes unfold according to rhythms beyond personal will. Attempts to dominate these rhythms create conflict, while alignment with them creates flow. This does not remove responsibility, it refines it. Action taken from understanding is more effective than action driven by anxiety. The individual becomes responsive, rather than reactive. Observation also reveals the false identities that control tries to protect. The image of who one thinks they must be begins to soften. Expectations inherited from others lose their authority. Through awareness, the individual recognizes where effort has been spent maintaining an outdated self-concept. Letting go of control allows a more authentic expression to emerge, one that is not constantly defending itself. True change unfolds when awareness replaces force. Life begins to be experienced as a dialogue rather than a battlefield. By observing rather than controlling, the individual learns to trust timing, meaning, and inner guidance. Change becomes organic instead of exhausting. What once required struggle now arises naturally, guided by insight rather than fear. Personal growth is often imagined as the process of becoming better, stronger, or more refined, yet true growth moves in a different direction. It requires turning toward the parts of the self that have been avoided, denied, or pushed into the background. These hidden aspects do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They remain active beneath the surface, influencing behavior, emotions, and choices in indirect ways. Growth beggy. When awareness is willing to include what was once excluded. The aspects of the self that are avoided are usually those that were judged unacceptable at some point. They may include vulnerability, anger, fear, dependency, ambition, or even sensitivity. Early experiences often teach individuals which traits are rewarded and which are discouraged. Over time, the disowned parts are separated from conscious identity and stored out of sight. This division creates an inner imbalance, where only certain qualities are allowed expression while others operate unconsciously. What is hidden does not remain passive. Suppressed aspects seek expression through symptoms rather than clarity. They emerge as emotional reactions that feel disproportionate, recurring conflicts, self-sabotage, or persistent dissatisfaction. Because these expressions are indirect, they are often misunderstood and blamed on external circumstances. In reality, they are signals pointing toward parts of the self that have not yet been acknowledged or accepted. Integration begins with recognition rather than judgment. When a hidden aspect surfaces, the instinct is often to suppress it again or label it as weakness. Growth requires a different response, curiosity. Observing these parts without immediate condemnation allows their function to become clear. Even traits that seem negative usually formed as adaptations, attempts to protect or preserve the self under specific conditions. Understanding their origin transforms resistance into insight. As integration progresses, inner conflict begins to soften. Energy once spent maintaining psychological defenses becomes available for creative and purposeful expression. The individual no longer needs to act against themselves to preserve a fragile self-image. Wholeness replaces perfection as the guiding aim. This shift brings stability, not because difficulties disappear, but because the internal foundation becomes more inclusive and resilient. Avoided aspects often carry essential qualities needed for growth. Vulnerability allows connection. Anger reveals violated boundaries. Fear sharpens awareness, and uncertainty opens space for change. When these elements are integrated, they stop operating destructively and begin contributing constructively. What was once experienced as an obstacle becomes a source of strength. Personal growth is therefore not an ascent away from the darker or messier parts of the self, but a descent into honesty. It is the willingness to see oneself fully without fragmentation. Integration does not mean acting out every impulse, but understanding and incorporating its message. Through this process, the self becomes more coherent, grounded, and authentic. Growth unfolds not through rejection of the hidden, but through its conscious inclusion. Psychological shifts rarely occur in dramatic or instant moments of realization. They unfold slowly, often so subtly that they are only recognized in retrospect. The mind prefers clear beginnings and endings, but inner change follows a different rhythm. It moves in cycles, layers, and quiet adjustments that accumulate over time. This gradual unfolding is not a flaw in the process. It is what allows transformation to become stable rather than temporary. In the early stages of a psychological shift, there is often confusion rather than insight. Old ways of thinking begin to feel insufficient, yet new perspectives have not fully formed. This in-between state can feel uncomfortable, as if the ground beneath one's identity is softening. Impatience arises during this phase because the ego seeks resolution. However, forcing conclusions too quickly often results in superficial change that collapses under pressure. Patience creates the space needed for deeper understanding to take root. As time passes, small internal adjustments begin to occur. Emotional reactions soften, even if external circumstances remain unchanged. Situations that once triggered strong response are met with greater neutrality or curiosity. These changes may seem insignificant, but they signal a reorganization happening beneath awareness. The psyche integrates new insights gradually to avoid fragmentation. What enters too quickly cannot be sustained. Patience during psychological change is an act of trust. It means allowing uncertainty without immediately demanding answers. This willingness to remain with not knowing strengthens awareness and resilience. Rather than seeking constant reassurance, the individual learns to observe inner movements as they arise and pass. Through this observation, clarity begins to emerge naturally, not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady alignment between perception and reality. Rushing psychological growth often leads to resistance or self-deception. The mind may adopt new beliefs or language without fully embodying them. This creates an illusion of progress, while underlying patterns remain unchanged. Lasting clarity cannot be adopted. It must be earned through lived experience and reflection. Time allows insights to be tested, challenged, and integrated into daily life. As the shift continues, clarity becomes less intellectual and more experiential. Decisions feel quieter and more grounded. There is less need to justify choices or seek external validation. The individual begins to sense what is true through inner coherence rather than external approval. This clarity is stable because it is rooted in integration, not impulse. Psychological shifts reward patience by reshaping perception itself. What once appeared confusing gradually reveals its meaning. Contradictions find their place, and inner conflict diminishes. The clarity that emerges is not rigid or absolute. It is flexible and alive. It allows movement, adaptation, and authenticity. Growth that unfolds slowly endures because it is aligned with the natural tempo of the psyche. What is given time becomes trustworthy, and what is trusted becomes clear. And so, if you find yourself in a season where nothing feels settled yet everything feels meaningful, trust that this is not delay, but design. Psychological change does not rush because it is reshaping the foundation, not just the surface. What is forming within you needs time to become stable, honest, and whole. Stay present with the process, even when clarity feels distant. The patience you practice now is quietly transforming confusion into understanding. When the shift completes, you will not only see more clearly, you will stand more firmly in who you have become.